Welcome to the Fine Print, where we explore the untapped potential hiding in plain sight.
If we go down 5 years, nobody would really think that businesses write contracts on sort of PDF scribbles anymore.
Welcome to the Fine Print. I'm Kalina Tonkovska, founder and CEO of Programmatic. At Programmatic, we're on a mission to redefine how companies are handling documents. Essentially, we want to grab static documents like PDFs and docs and turn them into dynamic smart files. We're using artificial intelligence to translate human text into automated workflows. And one of our main focuses is legal documents. So we are very heavily involved and meticulous about security. And so in the Fine Print, this is a series that explores untapped potential. Every episode will feature an expert to uncover the secrets buried in the small fine print and show how businesses are using innovation to stay ahead. And today, I'm very happy to have Janne Jutila, Head of Business Alliances at Signicat. Janne has spent years at the forefront of building secure, scalable trust solutions. And together, we'll talk a lot about digital identity, the whole trust framework, how businesses are leveraging it, and how they're using it also to protect documents and set a standard for trust. So, Janne, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, what you're doing at Signicat.
Sure. Thanks, Kalina. And nice to be here at Programmatic Talks. Janne Jutila is my name. I'm Finn by nationality. Within Signicat, I head the sort of partners and business alliances activity, and also very much involved in the sort of payments and wallet space. Signicat, as you might or might not know, we are sort of digital identity leader within Europe. We cover the full identity lifecycle, everything from onboarding to trust orchestration to authentication and digital signatures. And that is, of course, the sort of common touchground that we have with Programmatic here is the digital signature space.
Absolutely. So for someone who doesn't know about digital identity, for the broader audience, let's say, how would you describe what digital identity's value is?
Yeah, it was maybe 15 years ago when I started, and then nobody knew anything about digital identity. But at its sort of broadest and simplest, internet was made for machines to communicate with each other, computers to communicate. But business is done by people. So the problem of identity comes from the fact that when we do transact over the internet, not only the computers connect to each other, but the people should connect to each other. And the problem is, how do I know who am I connecting with? And that is the fundamental problem that digital identity is solving. And then the sort of variations from that is, of course, that you have to create a digital identity one way or the other. We call it identity proofing. I think everybody's aware of that nowadays. When you onboard to any digital service, you do identity proofing as part of the sort of know your customer process. Then you have the authentication, the sort of continuous authentication towards the service that you're using or towards any computer system or other. Traditionally was username password, but since they are so poor, both in user experience and in security, much more advanced ways of authentication have developed. And then the third sort of major element is sort of agreeing on something, effectively giving consent or signing a contract. I give permission for you to do something, or we agree on doing something together. And that's the sort of digital signature part. And it sort of draws on both identity proofing and authentication, because of course, when I sign a contract, I need to know with whom I sign the contract. So I think in its simplest, it's that. And then the rest is sort of tech mambo jumbo that builds around it and then gives more detail and flavor.
Yeah, would you say on this topic, that this authorization or the signature part was most developed for a very long time, and then people were relying on poor authentication before in terms of using weak passwords and maybe some kind of two-factor authentication at best?
I would almost argue the opposite. Yeah, identity proofing has developed widely, because that is such an inbuilt need for any service, any company to essentially know who are they dealing with, who are their customers, their partners, their employees, etc. Authentication is an obvious need, because you need to, in order to be able to use a service, you need to authenticate into the service so that we know, or the service provider knows, that who is this person, what data do we have on him or her, and then what have been the previous transactions and other customer data. But the digital signature part, I think, is the most undeveloped area of these three, at least. vast majority of contracts between companies and between sort of consumers and companies are still sort of, they're either sort of email approvals or consents to click a button to give a consent type of things, or they are sort of PDFs with scribbles on them. Which is absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't tell anything about who has signed the contract when you do it over the internet. You might have some supporting email traffic sort of as the context of the contract, but the contract itself doesn't have any intelligence. It doesn't have any legal reliability as such. So, but that has been fast changing in the last few years also.
I think from my point of view, there were very poor versions of digital signatures for a very long time, for many years. And then more recently, we see proper signatures, proper security and framework around them. And then I think companies, from our conversations with some prospects, we see a lot of times companies are not aware of how they can have a better signature process, a better trust embedded into their contracts. And for them, it's still this uncertainty that it might not be secure.
Yeah, I think overall, a scribble on a PDF is not a digital contract. It's a paper contract that is transmitted digitally, but there's nothing digital about it as such.
And there are three levels of the signature validity and security, right? There is the simple one, the advanced, and the qualified one.
Within the EU regulation, yes. So of course, like many other sort of subdomains in this space, EU has been most known for developing regulation, and digital signatures likewise have these three levels of security. And of course, what we see is a continuous transformation from the sort of non-digital PDF scribbles towards the sort of reasonable and higher security levels. And then advanced electronic signatures are, I think, pretty much the norm in large parts of Europe nowadays, because they have some legal meaning. And then when you go to qualified electronic signatures, then they are legally binding documents according to law. So that takes away the discussion whether it's a proper contract or not.
In Europe, I think also there is this interesting specific about the UK post-Brexit and how they're processing qualified electronic signatures on documents. What we've found, we are UK-based, and what we found is a lot of companies are not using qualified electronic signatures. They would rather go with ink, especially on some high-value documents and contracts. So what do you think about that? Do you think that is part of regulation catching up? Do you think it's about companies also being a little bit more hesitant, let's say, to use proper signatures?
I would sort of contribute that to, I worked for several years in London on digital identity topics on a sort of global basis, and then the relationship that the Brits, and I would apply that to the US people also, have, the Anglo countries have towards digital identity is very different from what we have in Nordics or nowadays in other parts of Europe. For British people, identity is it's a service specific concept in a way. So you don't have identity providers in the meaning that we are used to. Government is not the sort of source of identity, or government is a source of multiple identities. You have a different tax identity and you have a different passport identity, and then every government department has a separate identity that they think is the real identity. You don't have a national population register in the sense that most other countries in Europe nowadays have. So I think from that it builds that, identity is much more sort of, it's an agreement between two parties. If I'm comfortable that you sign a paper with your pencil and then you courier mail it to me and then I sign it, and then we have a paper contract with two signatures that we assume that are the right signatures, then we go forward from that. And of course, the sort of tradition from course has proven that it works. But the sort of time and cost of signing an agreement is not something that would sort of well mix with the need of speed in the digital business arena.
Exactly. And on that thought, we are approaching different sectors. So we have a little bit of industry feedback on what type of sectors are more or less prone to adopting digital solutions before we go into wallets and a more complex trust framework. So what do you think about the sectors? Which sectors do you or Signicat has any insight on are more adaptive of this kind of solutions? Because from our experience in the properties, construction and real estate sector, they're very, very conservative and still perceive this as a nice to have as opposed to a need to have.
Yeah, there's different industries are progressing at very different levels. and depends also on the type of whether you discuss sort of consumer agreements or B2B agreements. But I would say the front runners in this space, at least on the sort of consumer contract side, they have certainly been, for example, the banks in Nordics that have gone fully digital signatures in their contracts, in loan contracts, in everything. And that builds from the fact that since years already, the banks have found out that running physical branches is super expensive. So they've been cutting down the branch network. There's not a place where you can go for a loan discussion and sign of a loan contract on a sort of paper, wet ink type of signature, but much rather they do a video conf where you need to authenticate who you are, you discuss on the video conf, and then post the video conference, the bank sends you a digital contract for signatures that you sign digitally using your existing bank IDs and national EID schemes that you have in these countries. Neobanks, I think, is a perfect example of something similar. Maybe not so much on the signature side, but certainly they are so digital and mobile first banks. Then, of course, many other areas like payments and money transfer companies, payment service providers and others have been quite fast moving. But yeah, large portions of the sort of businesses are very traditional, but there's a change happening. And of course, within Signicat, we have benefited from that change. And that is probably one of the reasons why we have been on the sort of Financial Times 100 fastest growing companies in Europe since last 10 years. This is an area which I think even the slow movers will adapt in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think this is a great segue actually into Signicat's involvement. I may be skipping a few topics here, but Signicat's involvement in the European project for the digital identity wallet. And I know that you're very well versed into this topic. So can you tell us a bit about what Signicat and you are doing there?
Yeah, well, anything that benefits the progress of digitalization, including in the signature area, of course, is a benefit for us. We are a enabler. We are a service provider to companies like Programmatic or others. We have a very good signature service that you can integrate into your solution. Like you, many have done that. The regulation has been developing around this topic, like all digital trust services within EU. eIDAS 1.0, maybe 8-9 years ago when it came into force, was rather groundbreaking in many ways. eIDAS 2.0 that has recently been approved and where the sort of implementation acts are being approved. I think it has a few big notions. First of all, it sort of much further details the regulation around trust services. Digital signatures is one of the trust services. Timestamps is another, and authentication and pretty much the services that I previously discussed. So there's sort of a sort of more modern regulatory framework around those services. And then, of course, there starts to be more and more sort of demand and regulatory pressure that you should use these legally binding sort of secure digital contracts when you do contracts between companies and or consumers. So we contribute to that effort on multiple levels, both on the sort of technical level, how to build interoperability into these services, but we are also very much involved on the sort of piloting and commercialization through the sort of EU large scale pilots that are in operation in this space.
Yep. And at what phase is currently the project?
Well, the EU LSPs, the large scale pilots, they are EU funded sort of pilots where large consortiums of governments and companies have come together to solve some sort of fairly fundamental use cases. For example, the EWC, the European Wallet Consortium, probably has something in the region of 200 large companies. Some of the core members include players like Visa and Signicat and others. And there we try to solve, for example, payments, travel issues. Then there's some other large-scale pilots that solve issues like corporate identity and then the use of company identity in B2B contexts, etc. So there's in fact 4 of these pilots altogether. We're involved in 2 of them, and each of them have 2 or 3 sort of fundamental use cases that they try to solve on a relatively wide scope across Europe. And they, of course, should sort of help the development of the technical rules and regulations, but they also should help to launch the sort of EU identity wallets that are a obligation of EU member states to launch within 2 years after the regulations come in place. So we're talking roughly the end of 26 when all EU countries should have a EU identity wallet launched for their citizens.
Okay, I have a couple of questions here. Maybe one of the first questions that I have is on interoperability. So this is a very big topic. Some countries are notoriously less advanced technologically, so to say, in comparison to other countries. So how would you handle interoperability in that way? What are the biggest challenges there?
There's a lot of discussion here, and I have to, given my sort of background, I was much involved in the eIDAS 1 interoperability sort of. I was leading the first cross-border test of eIDAS 1, and I'm a bit of a sort of doubter here. I don't think that will be achieved, but interoperability will be achieved from the sort of regulatory framework perspective, and within that, then commercial solutions will solve this problem across borders. I'm not a great believer that governments are able to launch identity wallets that can be used for signatures. Yes, they can do that, but whether they will be usable, whether they have the customer support for companies and users, citizens, in the right scale and manner for them to become the sort of daily used tools, I very much doubt. I think they will be rather sort of onboarding tools towards commercial identity payments wallets that then will be used for signing signatures. So in my perspective, these sort of identity wallets, they are just another identity provider, like any electronic identity provider that we currently have, bank IDs and mobile IDs and others. There's maybe 35 or so schemes around Europe today.
I think this wallet discussion reminds me of, I have a bit of experience with CBDCs, so central bank digital currencies for the audience. And this reminds me of conversations a few years back on whether government issued wallets or commercial wallets will be rather used. And there were a lot of pilots and a lot of buzz around this topic. And then suddenly a lot of this quieted down.
Well, yeah, I'm not surprised to it. And I've been very much looking into this. I'm fascinated by this sort of this space also, but the likelihood that people will do sort of payments on a daily level through government issued wallets that would have payment credentials for digital central bank currency, I think I find it highly unlikely.
Yeah.
There will be private sector identity payment wallets that people will use, and then they just use the sort of EU identity wallets to onboard into these private wallets. Some people see that as a disappointment towards eIDAS 2.0. I see it as a great achievement if we get to that.
Yeah.
But the similar, I think this discussion has been in the identity space, and it sort of applies to the contracts. There was a big fuss about this sort of personal data privacy, self-sovereign identity, user-controlled identity. And then when you think a bit deeper into it, they are really nice sort of visions and even ambitions, but in reality, they have so many limitations that the world will not play out like that. A very simple example would be if you have a fully decentralized identity solution, it means that when you lose your phone where your identity credentials are, essentially you lose the whole account. There's no account recovery. That alone is enough to sort of make them unfeasible. In the signature side, I think there was a lot of discussion about these smart contracts, sort of fully programmatable contracts.
Yeah.
Sound very nice, but no or next to none lawyers are able to read the code of the contract, understand how it works. So you effectively, what you need is a combination of written contract with some executable, simple pieces of it.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. I wasn't planning on going into programmatic, but an interesting point of how we started officially 2 years ago with research. And obviously smart contracts were a very big thing, and they still are to a certain extent. So we were researching the market. Would companies be open to using some form of smart blockchain-based contracts? And the amount of frustration and insecurity and stress from legal professionals and also from business owners was just so big. So I think it is it is all about grabbing this type of innovation, nurturing it, and making it in a way that it functions well into society in a fail-proof way.
Exactly, and these things are examples, I think, from sort of combining sort of new approaches to the existing frameworks that we have in order for scaling. So I think that very much the same applies to digital signatures altogether. If we go down 5 years, nobody would really think that businesses write contracts on sort of PDF scribbles anymore. The whole notion is ridiculous in a way. In when you conduct the discussions over video conferencing, and then you move the sort of documents around through emails, and then you need to sign. You need some level of security and regulatory compliance into the signature, and then you go for a digital signature.
I think this is also an interesting topic on, I'm always trying to think of like, what are the next 5 years, 10 years going to be? So I mentioned earlier before the conversation, I lived a little bit in Finland, but I'm originally from Bulgaria, and the gap between those two countries in the sense of how we're handling security in terms of signatures or documents or whatever, it's so big. And I'm thinking with these kinds of innovations, companies, for example, Finland or in the Nordics or other countries are going to use them to advance, and then there are going to be countries that might be left behind. So how would these businesses or even governments from these two countries interact? And I think this is something that we don't think about a lot, but technology is developing at such a fast rate. I think at some point it would be a problem.
Could be, but it's also, of course, it's a problem in digitalization in general. Many people find it extremely difficult to function in today's world. If you're old, if you're not very handy in using a smartphone, or you're unable to keep your computer safe from viruses, etc., being a sort of person in the digital world becomes very difficult. Older people have problems, and many other groups of people have problems, and this sort of applies across countries to some degree also. But within countries, there's always sort of advanced people that are the front runners, and then they essentially see the development of the others. But it takes time. Obvious things take long time to happen in sort of scale. They're still obvious; they will happen. The question is whether it's 5 years or 10 years.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's more leaning towards 5 years. It's really developing quite fast. Hopefully the other countries catch up.
Yeah, we'll have, I'm not starting the counting from today. The start has been years ago already.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned use cases. We covered that a little bit, but I'm curious. You said there is consumer and then there's B2B, so B2C or B2B use cases. Where do you think people, like a general large audience, where would they see the fastest impact, the biggest value soon in terms of implementing digital wallets, for example, and a proper?
Well, digital wallets, I think, is by nature, they're similar to credit card schemes in a way. They're four-corner business models. So digital wallets and digital wallet ecosystems work when you have a large number of users or consumers on the other side, and a large number of relying parties or service providers on the other side. And the digital wallet brings those two together, enables them to sort of interact and transact and sign documents, make payments between each others, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think that's the type of wallet ecosystems, and then some people call them wallet wars, that will come about, the ecosystems battle, because there's a lot of scale benefits in them. But on the other hand, there's a lot of sort of niche areas where you can have a sort of dedicated wallets. Travel is a good example. There's sort of certain set of companies that are involved in travel, be they airlines or be they car rentals or be they hotels, etc. So most likely there will be travel specific wallets, but there are much smaller niches also where you will have niche wallets, all kinds of sort of strange areas. So you will have these very generic wallets, and then you will have these very niche wallets, and then everything in between. And then they try to battle for survival.
You think there will be a fragmentation of the landscape, and what would that mean for users then?
Well, I think there will be, first fragmentation and then some level of consolidation, of course. That's how things usually play out. I think some of the leading sort of large digitally savvy companies, they will be wallet issuers. They will facilitate these wallet ecosystems. They will provide tools to their essentially it can pretty much be in the same tool. The same wallet can be used for consumer sort of authentication and signing. It can be used for employee access to computer systems, and it can be used for suppliers and others for B2B contracts. And these sort of leading companies will essentially become the wallet issuers that say that, hey, if you do business with us, this is how you do it. You use the sort of credentials that we have identity proofed and then issued to you. And this is how you sign contracts with us. And then, of course, many other companies will just use those tools because they are available and they work and they are easy to use and they're secure. So I don't think all companies should aim, or in fact, very few companies should aim to develop their own sort of wallet propositions. They would much rather should consider as to which wallet ecosystems they should join.
Yeah, because also there is the need for critical mass and for proper environment to depend on.
Yeah, and then the same applies on the digital signature space. This developing a properly working sort of cross-border digital signature solution is quite an undertaking.
Yeah.
Both sort of skill and investment wise. Having a really good sort of document management system is quite an undertaking that uses digital signatures as one piece, but then adds many other pieces from other areas, sort of manage the documents, how to negotiate them, how to use templates as a way of creating efficiency, develop new documents, etc. So these sort of document management systems will be ecosystems in themselves in a way.
Yeah. On that topic, do you think we've been seeing a lot lately companies switching from signature companies to, signature, digital signature provider companies to overall document management and covering all services? Would you say that companies should be moving towards a more, in your view, of course, in a more general kind of platform covering multiple capabilities? Or do you think that this necessity to provide a very complex service demands a focus primarily on this trust part of the whole landscape?
Ideally, they would be combined into the same solution, of course.
Yeah.
I really don't see a reason why they couldn't.
Yeah. Okay.
The challenge is, of course, that growing an ecosystem, you start small and then you build benefits for a few parties coming together, and then slowly the benefits are so obvious that the network effects start to play a role.
Yeah, this is more of this was a bit more of a question towards the technical side, because apart from business, there's also my interest as a product person in seeing how companies are developing solutions. And I see people either on one or the other side. Either they think it's one solution for all and you should always move into that direction, or it's people or product companies that think you should be laser focused on what you're doing and then rely more on partnerships and integration.
And certainly there will be both and
Yeah.
all kinds of combinations of that, I think.
Yeah, it's a various landscape.
Yeah. Many people have compared these wallet wars into the browser wars of
Oh, really?
20 years ago in a way. And there's probably some similarities there. There was a lot of browsers in the market long ago, which then have consolidated into essentially just a few large global ones. I don't see the consolidation going as far in the sort of wallet ecosystems or digital signature document management systems, especially. I think they will be much more focused towards specific verticals because the needs of the verticals are quite different.
Yeah.
The templates that you would use on real estate contracts are quite different than the ones that you would use for software licensing type of things. Yeah. And the way the contracts are negotiated and drafted and so on, they are quite different. It was really fascinating in this space. I was a long time ago. I was much involved in the sort of startup company that started developing cargo trading documentation, contract management,
like an electronic bill of lading.
Yeah, that was part of it. But essentially, the key was this sort of when the sort of cargo brokers agree on a ship and a cargo to be transported from A to B, and then they were using telefaxes at the time. So they were essentially negotiating the contracts on telefaxes. The templates that they were using in especially bulk cargoes, they were sort of the templates of Exxon or the templates of BP, and then they negotiate sort of twists and turns around that. And then, of course, the natural thing 20 years ago was to put it on internet so that you could negotiate it online, and you could essentially sort of agree on the contract, and then you could sort of print it out on both sides, and then you could sign it and mail it. Because at that time there was no digital signature solutions yet.
Yeah.
But now, of course, it has advanced much further. So there will be very niche sort of contract management solutions for specific verticals that serve the needs of the companies in the vertical, and they essentially form the sort of ecosystem where all the companies in the value chain come together.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you discuss the sort of B2B side.
Yeah, I think so too. I think this is where, I mean, it's definitely every vertical has its specific needs, and then more generalized solutions are harder to break through in a certain vertical. So getting back,
or they might be for the sort of SMBs more, in a way.
Yeah.
They are not sort of so focused and so they don't operate on a scale. So they do one contract now and one then, and then they use a more generic contract solution for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the sort of large scale companies, they do contracts on a regular basis, and they need to have the much further sort of automation, much further document management, contract management.
On this topic, this is a very interesting, very much a side note story, but I met this person who had this very interesting platform, which was widely successful, and it was about generating legal templates using artificial intelligence, I believe they were using, to generate ready-made legal templates for SMBs. And my initial thought was a big enterprise could never, there's a whole legal team and this would be a complete catastrophe. But then for smaller companies, it does work. So it's important which sector you're looking into. Yeah.
Well, the legal side of companies is typically not the front runner on digitalization.
Yeah.
Within Signicat, we, of course, our challenge has for a long time has been we traditionally we sell towards IT people, the CTOs and CISOs and others, these identity solutions. Whereas the real need is a business need. So we try to approach the business people and explain to them why they should care about customer identity, KYC, AML and other stuff, and build it in a way that it sort of supports the business rather than hinders it.
Yeah.
And I think legal is the sort of third and sort of slowest mover in many occasions.
Absolutely.
They barely budge to the needs of the business people either.
Yeah, I completely agree. We work with a lot of law firms, so it's really funny. Sometimes indeed they're very conservative, but we see a lot of innovative law firms that we work with, and not only that, are even developing their own solutions to kind of speed up certain parts of legal technology and or legal work actually, and then also make sure that contracts are handled accurately, because there are situations in which you definitely need a very high grade of security and how you're handling this document onward. So it's interesting. But on topic of use cases, because we are talking about the business people and the business needs, and then indeed, I think a lot of companies, including ourselves, we've had a lot of experience in trying to explain in very technical terms what we're doing, but business people don't really care about that, and that makes sense. So which companies do you think most need a solution like Signicat's digital identity and trust orchestration, and why? Why do you think they would need it most? Maybe they don't realize it yet.
Well, yeah, that's a very broad discussion if we start discussing digital identity in general. If I look from the sort of digital signature side, signature solutions, like I said, I think the front runners have been in areas, for example, in B2C space, where you need to sign high-value contracts on a very sort of regular basis, like banks, loan contracts, etc. But then it's sort of spreading towards other verticals where you sign contracts on a much less frequent basis. And then, of course, the ones that have sort of high-value contracts, they are concerned about the sort of the legal status of the contract, and therefore they start demanding advanced electronic signatures from their suppliers and others, so that they are legally binding contracts, and then more and more also companies are demanding qualified electronic signatures in certain types of contracts for security purposes. That type of use cases, I think now we are at the stage where it's sort of breaking through to all kinds of business areas and use cases. It's not just one or two use cases anymore. It's all kinds of contracts start to be secure digital contracts.
Yeah.
And the obvious sort of three reasons that always drive this type of development and applies to wider digital identity topics also is the sort of user experience. So in the context of contracts, what is the experience of negotiating and signing the contract? Is it a consumer or B2B? But still, that is a big issue. Wet ink on paper and then the courier service, courier picking it up from your office and all this hassle is enormously sort of time consuming and expensive. So the user experience is not that great. Cost is an obvious factor also, especially in companies that sort of sign contracts sort of occasionally in normal types of business settings and use cases. The per contract cost is typically not a big issue. And it's by far cheaper anyway than sending paper contracts through couriers. We're talking totally different sort of cost structures here. And of course, the level of security compared to a PDF scribble is way different. If you have proper sort of identity proofing or authentication of the person, if you have the contract sort of issued on a proper sort of secure credential, which can be verified afterwards that this is exactly the text that was signed, gives you legal protection that nobody has been tampering with the contract, and then all these aspects sort of push towards using more secure digital contracts. And then of course the regulatory requirements and security needs is the third element.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a question about regulations, and I'm cautious with time, but I did want to make a point here about which companies might want to use or need to use proper digital secure signatures. And this reminds me of a couple of governments that we already heard about are opening, let's say, calls with companies to seek digital solutions for proper, secure legal solutions, right? We know the Nordics are very active on this part, especially in terms of companies that are working closely with governments. They need to report on their contracts and they need a proper audit trail and they need proper signatures. So they're getting pushed to implement the solution if they haven't already. And this is an interesting point, just that even in Central and Southern Europe, where this is not yet a necessity, regulation is coming and companies are already actively exploring ways to implement it. So I think companies, especially in the more stringent sectors, should be looking into implementing a solution like Signicat, definitely. And when it comes to regulations, this is probably a very important part of the discussion, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on what kind of regulations are coming in that obviously ADAS 2.0, but are there any other regulations that are going to push companies to need to comply with proper security on this end?
Yeah, well, this is a sort of a never-ending story in a way, because there's a lot of regulation in this sort of digital space nowadays. On multiple levels and directions and issuers. The challenges that we battle with is of course, one, there's a lot of EU level regulation on multiple fronts, but then there's sort of implementation variations by EU member state on many areas. Not so much on digital signature. I think that's a fairly homogenic sort of space compared to, for example, payments regulation or financial onboarding regulation, which is highly country specific. If you do a financial onboarding in Germany, it looks quite different from the financial onboarding in UK. And therefore, we need to offer all kinds of solutions that be combined in all kinds of combinations to be sort of both efficient with good user experience and then cost efficient and then regulatory compliant in different country schemes or regulatory setups. And then there's a lot of sort of recommendation type regulation in a way that companies in specific verticals should follow. Healthcare, I think, is a traditional example. They have healthcare related regulation. I think for digital signatures, healthcare is one area where you probably have to move relatively fast when you do sort of give permissions to health operations, etc. You probably should have it in some type of a contract form in a way. Also, B2B ecosystems in healthcare, they need to document things. They need to have them properly documented, that medical equipment has been properly serviced. Maintenance is another sort of niche area where you need to document every action, every transaction needs to be properly documented. But there's an endless amount of these sort of business-specific needs that essentially drive the widespread usage for example, digital signatures. So from these sort of niche cases, then it starts to become, at some point, it's easier for companies to just say that, hey, we do all agreements through this signing service. So if you do an agreement with us, then we sign it like this. And instead of thinking per contract, what type of signature is okay in this context. It's kind of sort of becomes part of the sort of governance rules of the company that when you sign contracts above X, then you need to do a advanced electronic signature.
I think even advanced is so risky when you're referring to signatures. So we're quite ahead of time. So I wanted to ask you one last question, unless you want to cover something else as well, of course. But what are you most excited about in this space? And is there something we can expect from Signicat in the coming, let's say, few years that you think is going to be most exciting?
I think one, we discussed it quite a bit already earlier, but this sort of amount of identity providers that can be used for signatures is going to multiply. Today, like I said, we have integrated 35 electronic identity schemes together, and they can be used for identification of signatories and then to sign contracts. And then, of course, you have the document-based identity proofing solutions that can be used also so that we can give full coverage across countries. But these sort of identity schemes will multiply. So we need to do a lot of integration work to bring them together to behind a single API, behind a single signing engine. So that is certainly something that our IT guys are looking forward to. And of course, it applies in our case also to very much towards product people that need to productize all these into the same product. So that's one major development. Tools for signing will multiply in the next few years, 2-3 years. EU identity wallets plus all kinds of commercial private sector wallets will be tools for signatures going forward. And then the other part, which I think is interesting, is this sort of combination of identity and money. Effectively, identity is the new money, said the Brit Dave Birch already 10 years ago now from Consult Hyperion at that time. Still a leading speaker on a sort of global scene. But effectively, if you think of a payments transaction, it's first and foremost, it's two things. It's an identity transaction between the payer and the payee, and then it's processing. It's sort of telecommunications, moving money from A to B. And then traditionally they have been combined, and they have always been so that money moves on separate rails. It has different sort of networks through which money is being moved. In future, and you see it already in the crypto world today, it's just telecommunication. It's just moving a crypto key from one place to another, nothing else. So if effectively all the value in the payments will move into the identity transaction. The payment authorization, we call secure customer authentication in payment language.
So in a way, it will merge together.
It will merge together to a very large extent. So your identity is a way is essentially a way of accessing your payment tools.
I think
these two things will change the scene quite a lot in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Wow. I definitely think this will affect everyone from consumer to business, definitely a lot.
Yeah.
Well,
but that gives a nice context, I think, into this space, into digital signatures. Then this sort of realm of having a written contract with payments integrated into it, automated payments integrated, and everything approved through the same signature. That starts to feel much more normal. That's probably how it should be.
Yeah, I think they were developing at different speeds, those two sectors, and now finally one is catching up.
They're starting to come together. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Janne, thank you so much for this conversation. It was absolutely amazing. I learned a lot of things, and I'm very excited to see what Signicat will bring on. And I'm very happy that we chose Signicat as a partner over a year ago. We're really, really happy to be able to have this sort of innovation built into programmatic.
Super. Nice talking to you, and all the best going forward, and happy to work with together.
Thanks for tuning into The Fine Print. The details matter. They always have, and they always will. Stay curious, stay bold, and we'll see you next time.